Okay, thanks, Alison. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. It's 4 o'clock. Welcome to the Safeguarding People and Tackling Poverty Corporate Delivery Committee for November. The first item on the agenda is apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence from Councillors Jeffrey and Councillor Alison Pugh, Cabinet Member.
Okay, second item on the agenda then is disclosures of personal and prejudicial interests. Okay, and then we're on to the minutes, agenda item 3, the minutes of the last meeting, which are in October, and they've all been shared with you. As people happy to move those? Yeah, Rebecca, somebody second that? Thanks, Leslie. That's great. And we're on to the main item of the agenda this week. It's a short agenda item, this month, which I'll talk about at the end. So what this agenda item is the Swansea Council Volunteering Strategy Development, and we've got Anthony in the room, as well as Julia online, and Amy's with us as well. So I think is that yourself, Anthony, that's feeding back. Yep. So there is a report in your pack that went out with the agenda, guys. If you want to refer to that while Anthony talks us through it.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm pleased to bring an update report to CVC today on the volunteering strategy development. This particular report is for information purposes, and it presents an example of what a good practice volunteer policy might look like. So the committee will be aware that a working group of officers has been involved, that have been involved with volunteers, has explored current practice across council services, and the group has also reviewed best practice volunteering policy in Wales. And I would particularly like to thank Julia Manser, SCVS Volunteer Centre Coordinator, for her support, partnering with us and working as a critical friend on this work. So it's been identified that development of a Swansea Council volunteer policy would establish consistent approaches and experiences for volunteers across the organisation, and create a common understanding and definition of volunteering, and clarify roles and responsibilities to ensure the highest standards are maintained. So currently we have various services within the authority that are hosting volunteers, and those experiences might not be consistent, and management might not have consistent approaches. So the example policy that's included with the report has been takes account of best practice as identified by Third Sector Support Wales, and it includes standards and commitments to roles and responsibilities, recruitment, selection, induction and training, as well as support and supervision. And the development of such a policy would provide the context then for the ongoing strategy development that we would envisage would follow that. So this report highlights a number of commitments that include development of a corporate volunteer handbook and toolkit for volunteer management. So the aspiration is that that would sit alongside the policy and be a resource tool for managers and anyone within the authority that is hosting volunteers. Yes, and the handbook. So as well as the handbook and toolkit, the report also highlights that there would a commitment of staff and financial resources would be required, but that would be within existing resources of the host services within the authority. So there's no additional funding at this moment in time to support this work. So the next steps, we're liaising with the Access to Services team, getting a survey set up, and we've got some draft content for StaffNet. We want to engage more services within the authority, make sure that we're not missing anyone who's involved with volunteers, to allow us to kind of access people who have that experience of volunteering with the authority, so that we can undertake some experience mapping and ongoing engagement and co-production going forward then from that point with those people that have that experience for the strategy development work. That's what we expect. So in due course, following going back to the working group, we would expect that the development of a draft Swansea Council volunteer policy as outlined would then follow for internal process for consideration for adoption. But at this moment in time, we thought it would be a great opportunity to bring what we see a good practice volunteer policy looking like to the CDC for comments, thoughts, and an opportunity to feedback.
That's great. Thanks, Tony. Anybody got any questions or comments to Tony or to Julia as well, who's been involved in this at this point? Leslie?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. A couple of things. Is this volunteer policy going to cover volunteers under the Friends of Groups umbrella? And the other one is to comment that it's quite clear, and this is very important, that volunteers do not replace anybody or any paid role. And I did note on page 7, there's a line where it says they may be involved in the direct delivery of our services. And I just think maybe we've got to be slightly careful there, because that could then overlap into somebody's, the possibility of having a paid position rather than a volunteer. But yeah, friends or groups, is it going to cover them? Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Walton. Yeah, so the policy is talking about volunteers that are hosted within services. We also recognise that people who volunteer alongside the authority and with services that the authority provides may not be hosted by, but working with in terms of a group. So I would see that the policy particularly applies to hosted opportunities within council services rather than necessarily a volunteer who's working with a voluntary group that works alongside the authority, if that makes sense. And in terms of volunteers not replacing any paid role or certainly statutory service, that's really, really critical. I think, yeah, perhaps there's a little bit more explanation that perhaps could go in there around how volunteers could potentially be involved with the direct delivery of the service, of a service, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are replacing or undertaking or delivering a key or statutory part of that council service, but complementing and working with that service, but involved with, again, if that makes sense.
Yes, thanks, Anthony. Yeah, I mean, I think it was just the way that line was written that maybe there ought to be just a slight clarification to make sure that that doesn't give anybody the impression that a paid job would be taken and replaced with a volunteer. It was just sort of that word, you know what, wording sometimes can be taken so many different ways. You know, we just have to be careful with it, that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Walton. Councillor Fogarty, and then I'll bring Julia Mansell in.
Thank you. Yeah, all looks good to me. The policy is very familiar from other roles I've had where there are, volunteers involved, so that seems good. Couple of questions. One is, perhaps I'm a bit ahead of the game on this, but I'm wondering, is the intention to focus on the consistency across existing volunteering opportunities? And in particular, do you think there's going to be any challenges with that around offering of expenses, given that it's within departmental budgets as opposed to there being a corporate pot? Or is the focus ultimately to actually increase the amount of volunteering that Swansea Council offers, as opposed to just kind of bringing that baseline up to a consistent level? So it'd just be useful to understand that. And then I'm going to start sounding like a stuck record on this issue, but the last time you brought a report back, I did mention about the impact assessment, and personally I feel that definitely the asylum seeker box, there's certainly a medium positive impact here, which I just still don't see reflected. I recognise that you've got needs further investigation against every single category, so I'm sure this will be picked up, but I just don't want it to be missed, because we are a city of sanctuary, and this does offer a significant opportunity for those seeking sanctuary here. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments. Yeah, so the policy, would apply across existing volunteering opportunities within the authority, but also any other opportunities that could be developed within services across the authority. So expenses, yeah, the policy would set that that standard and that that expectation that also any service that is hosting volunteer opportunities will reimburse those expenses, and that would be from within existing resources. So the expectation is that any service that is hosting volunteers would plan for that, profile for that in their budgets, to be able to do that effectively and meet the commitment of that policy. So bringing that standard consistent across all services. In terms of increasing volunteering opportunities, I'd like to think that the introduction of a policy, so bringing that standard consistent across the authority would be a good thing, which current volunteers would have that consistent experience. But also I would see then the development of the strategy following that's really where we're looking at how we promote those opportunities, how we work with other organisations and develop our thinking around volunteering with the organisation. And yeah, absolutely, thank you for reminding around that point around the IAA. So yeah, a full IAA will be part of this process, so there's a lot to explore in that process, and I do appreciate that asylum seekers would be one of the key groups to consider in that. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Tony. Julia, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to make a suggestion based on Councillor Walton's excellent point about being really clear about not utilising volunteers for paid staff's tasks. Maybe we can improve it by adding a hyperlink to the TUC WCVA charter, which sets out in very direct terms exactly why we wouldn't be utilising volunteers in that way, but keeping in the delivery of services, because that's what volunteers are currently doing, alongside and directed by the excellent staff that we have in the authority. But I think it could be improved by adding that hyperlink into the TUC WCVA charter, so I could work with Anthony in getting that linked in. Would that be something that Councillor would be happier with?
Yeah, Julia, that sounds a great idea. Thank you.
Okay. And just to really confirm exactly what Anthony has said in terms of the ambition, of course, is to develop more or different volunteering opportunities in the longer term. But right now it's about a kind of consistency, and it does seem that this policy does have a very direct commitment to the reimbursement of expenses, which, as Councillor Fogarty will know, that is a major factor in the involvement of many people, including those that are seeking sanctuary in our city.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. I just wanted to kind of reiterate that I totally support that being the policy. And I just wanted to have a clearer understanding really of that stepped approach that you seem to be taking in terms of its consistency now, increasing and promotion later. So on that basis then, just my last question would be kind of have you got a timescale in mind for when you'll be transitioning into that next, or completing this phase and moving into the next phase? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the working group is a key part of this, and engagement with existing volunteers is another key part of this, and of course people who don't volunteer with the authority but might like to. So we're looking to kind of expand that work at the moment, which will inform more the strategy, I would have thought, than it will feed into the policy, but more the strategy work going forward. We will be working with the working group on this example policy, thinking about the kind of practicalities of it. So as well as getting the comments here today, which is really helpful, we want to work through it with in a practical sense with the officers in the working group to understand what challenges there might be and how we work through those in kind of delivering how would this policy work on the ground. In terms of timescale, that would be the next step whilst we start that engagement work as well. But I would see us having a draft policy perhaps in the new year, or January, February, perhaps a draft policy taking shape that we can bring back to CVC and say this is our draft that we'd like to consider for going forward. And then the strategy will build on that. It's difficult to tie down a timescale there because it's really important that we co-produce properly, and sometimes that can take, we don't know how long that will take, but it's really important that we do that properly and thoroughly.
Okay, great. I can't see anybody else indicating. Thanks, Tony, for bringing that in, and can I just thank Julia as well for all the work that she's done and the consistent support she's given to the committee around this work. It's really important that MSCVS are involved in this as well, and isn't it? So it might be worth us just recapping the process because we've got some newer councillors in who started this year, just for them to understand the process of what happens next. So Tony referenced the draft policy. So the example that you've given today in the pack is just that, it's an example. So then there will be a draft document that will come here to the committee, and then there'll be do you want to recap on those stages, Alison? It's for councillors to remember because I can't remember them all, but how we process the policy then into the council proper from the CDC, so that councillors can understand exactly what's going to happen next.
Okay, usually with policies that are drafted by officers with the assistance of the committee, once the committee has agreed those the draft policy, it usually then either will go on to corporate management team for them to consider, or it'll go direct to cabinet for cabinet to adopt that new policy and for it to be approved.
Yeah, so then, and all the sort of statutory functions that you were asking about, Rebecca, in terms of the impact assessments and everything, happen at that stage. And then, as chair, I would go to cabinet and present the draft kind of thing, and then it gets moved forward from there, then adopted from there on. Sometimes it goes to full council, doesn't it? I think depends on what it is. Yeah. Any questions on that? Because I know when I first came across to the as a councillor, I had absolutely no idea what was going on. Come in, Rebecca.
Yeah, it's just to ask, so when it's been agreed by cabinet, is there like, it's all very well saying, right, this is the policy, there's the bit of paper that says it, but is there like a plan then for how it's actually implemented and like brought to life, if that makes sense? Because I can see otherwise it just sort of sitting on the intranet.
Yeah, thank you. Really good question. It's really important, but it's not that, So first of all, yeah, a key part of turning this into a draft to take forward for adoption is going to be that IAA process. And that's really important. Why we are also, alongside reviewing a draft policy with officers across the authority, that we're planning that engagement work and that co-production, because that will feed in to the full IAA process as well as the strategy development. So it's a few things happening at the same time. So one of the things that we are looking to do with this is it's not just introducing the policy itself, but we'll be engaging with the working group and looking at how we might, and I'm sure Julia will come in here and comment as well, but how we put together a toolkit which would be online then on StaffNet for managers across the authority that would help them to deliver their commitment on that policy. So whether it's recruitment tools, management tools, whatever that might be, how to set up a specific budget code within your service for volunteer management. We'll be looking to pull that together. That's what the handbook and toolkit refers to. So that would sit alongside the policy and support managers in the delivery of their commitments that are set out in the policy.
That in itself will need its own promotion and stuff as well, though, won't it? Otherwise, that is at risk, sitting on the internet.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. So yeah, how we do that, you know, we will look at doing that through CMT, through heads of service, through managers, and that would be, you know, disseminated that way through team meetings, etc. And I would see there being a role for the officer working group ongoing as well as a space where, you know, any services or managers who are involved in the delivery or working alongside volunteers has that space to come and share experience and talk with other officers that are doing the same thing.
I think this is probably something we return to in the new year when the draft document comes to us, and we can have a talk about how we measure some of this stuff as well. Then I guess, Julia, did you want to come in then at that point?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to add to Anthony was I do think, as Councillor has raised, the importance of comms in terms of sharing with officers that are managing volunteers or likely to be managing volunteers, the presence of this toolkit that will be available to ensure that everybody is quite clear what documents are there to support the best practice management and recruitment of volunteers, and for training modules possibly to be developed for staff so that they undertake the policy work day to day with the best information that they have. So I think that is something that the working group, the officer working group, will be discussing. But I think that is an excellent point raised by Councillor. So I think that it will be central to the success of the implementation of this policy.
Great. Yeah, thanks. I mean, again, it's probably not for today, but maybe for the next time. Well, February, I think, is the next time that you come to us. We'll discuss that in a second, the last agenda item. But I think also one of the things that we need to be thinking about is how we're capturing volunteers' own experience of being volunteers for services within Swansea. And that's going to be a really key measure, isn't it, in terms of how successful or not the new strategy and the policy is. But yeah, but that's for another day, I think. That's great. Thanks very much, Tony. Thanks, Julia, again for all of your hard work, and thanks for coming in person, Tony. It's nice to see it. Nice to see your face. So that's great. Okay. If there aren't any other questions or comments, I can't see anybody indicating. We'll move to the last agenda item, which is the work plan. So we're in a bit of the situation with the work plan is we've got some really large items in the agenda that are due to come to us in January. We don't actually have anything in the work plan for December because we've agreed to give officers a bit of time really to produce something for us in January and February because the items are quite large. So to begin with, there's a question for us really. As a group, it's not my decision, it's our decision as a committee. What you'd like to do for December? We could decide as a committee to not hold the meeting in December and wait until January. So the items for January would be creating a workforce to deliver more care service directly. And the first stage of that work, bear with me, it's referenced in your minutes on page 2 of the pack, which is support and development of a workforce and wellbeing strategy and plan for the directorate. So that's the first part of that item that we're looking at in this committee. So it's a very large piece of work, hence the time that we've provided for officers. And then finally, the second part of that in January would be I keep thinking looked after children. It's not looked after children. It's local area coordinators. Best practice policy guidance would be coming back to us as well in January. So that's what's happening in January. So it's up to us as a committee really to decide what we'd like to do for December. We could have a verbal report from officers on a couple of the other agenda items. There's not going to be much point, I would suggest, doing that on the volunteering work for obvious reasons. So I leave it open to the other councillors and committee what you'd like to do for December, really. Sorry, Councillor Walton and then Councillor Curtis.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'm tempted to say let's leave December, but be prepared perhaps for January or February's meeting, maybe to be a bit longer because, as you say, the actual work that we've got coming up. That would be my suggestion, and particularly as it's so close to Christmas as well for officers who might be on leave, etc., etc. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Wharton. Councillor Curtis?
I agree totally with Leslie. I think we need to give the officers a break for December. There's so much going on, to be honest with you. Everything's so really busy. And I'm quite happy to take extra work in January or February, whatever we need to be.
I'm getting nods. So we'll have okay to have a show of hands then. So I propose we won't have the meeting on the 19th of December. We'll give officers a bit of a break, as mentioned, and we'll come back in January. We shall have a show of hands. Okay, yeah, that's unanimous then. That's great. Okay, and then following on from that, and in February, Tony, to come back for the volunteering, hopefully with the draft policy, no pressure. And then we need to follow up on the corporate debt policy. I think that's pretty much in hand, but we need to follow up on that as well in February as well. Okay. Okay. Any comments, queries, thoughts at this time before I close the meeting? Rebecca.
Just on the corporate debt policy, when you say it's in hand, am I right in thinking it's got to come through this committee before it can go on its journey to adoption? Okay, and I guess I just feel that there's a certain amount of urgency around it. And I'm just wondering whether there's an officer on the call who might have a view of whether February is the earliest that's possible to see that. Not to put any pressure on unnecessarily, but in the circumstances we're in, I guess there are people who it will make a big difference.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Who was the officer that was leading on that?
That'll be me.
Oh,
Wasn't he, Tony?
Yeah, so we have like an early draft. We need to go through some internal process prior to bringing it here. It needs to go to CMT next. So we need to get that on the agenda for CMT, the next available slot. So that's an action for me to take away. And then, yeah, the next step then is that engagement and public consultation, which will inform the IAA as well. But the IAA process can start before it goes out to public consultation. But it needs to go through internal process before we bring it back to CDC for the recommendation that it move to that engagement and public consultation phase.
So I think probably the question is realistically, is it realistic to have it in January or
that'll depend on really on availability agenda for CMT and that any internal process that would allow you to make that decision to move it forward to the public consultation stage.
Okay. When would the agenda go out for the January meeting, Alison? Yeah. It's just so it's 23rd of January. 17th. So we could potentially leave it until very early in the new year, Tony, if you could let us know via email if that's realistic or not, and then we can slot it into the agenda item.
Sure.
If that's possible.
Sure.
Yeah,
I'll liaise with Alison to see when we can get that in.
Yeah, that would be perfect. Yeah, that's a really important point, Councillor Fogarty. Okay, if there aren't any other questions or comments, can I thank everybody for their attendance. Thanks to all the officers for their ongoing support. Thanks to Democratic Services in particular for organising everything for me, and to Alison for sorting me out most of the time when I'm otherwise engaged. We won't meet now obviously until January, so have a great Christmas everybody and a nice new year, and we'll see you in the new year. Thank you.